Hello, everyone, and welcome to COVID University. And if you see the camera shake a bit, that's because I have a blind and deaf dog in my room, and she's bumping into things. But I think she's settled down now. All right, so here we go. What we're going to deal with today is we're going to start our very first in our series of lectures for sociology and doing our distance learning thing. And I know this is a little weird, you're not familiar with this, and it's not interactive. Usually when I do lectures, I like to open it up to questions and have some input, and I can get a sense of what you're interested in and that kind of thing, and it kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. In this case, it's not so much. I don't have that kind of feedback to do, so I'm kind of stuck. And normally with my flipped classroom lectures, I can usually add some graphics and some stuff like that to make it a little bit more interactive, but unfortunately with these I have to do a relatively quick turnaround with the lectures. So, but I'll do the best I can. So we're going to adapt, improvise, and overcome. That's the underlying theme of education in the United States. So here we go. So what we're going to deal with today is we are going to deal with a topic that is near and dear to my heart, because this is one of the reasons why I got into sociology, was to work with those people who didn't necessarily fit into the larger social standards. So they are a group of folks that we refer to as, in sociology, as deviants. In other words, they deviate from the normal expectations of behavior that society holds as standard for everybody. They don't necessarily follow the established norms and values that society has established. So therefore, they are pointed out as being those who don't fit in. They are deviants. They deviate from the norm. And this is a bit of a problem for sociology, right? Because up to now, everything that I've talked about with regard to sociology has always kind of made the assumption that everything kind of fits together and everybody acts according to the rules, and the rules are created through institutions, and these institutions then reinforce the rules as people act on those rules that reinforce, and everything seems to work out pretty well. But one of the things that we know is that it doesn't, right? We do know that there are folks who break the rules, who don't fit in, who don't follow the norms, who are in some ways outsiders. So take, for instance, this guy, right? What do you think? When you see this guy, what's the first thing that you think? Now, some of you are like, hey, wow, cool, he's got a lot of tattoos, but really, is this somebody you'd want, to invite to your birthday party, or maybe making you a sandwich, or somebody that you would vote for president of the United States? I don't know, probably not. So if you looked at this guy and you thought, wow, what is wrong with that guy? Well, there you go. What you're doing is you're identifying that this person is in fact a deviant, and in fact you are making a leap, right? You are taking a standard leap, right? And that leap is that you are making the assumption that the deviance in this person is actually located inside the person, that there's something wrong with this particular individual that makes him deviant, right? But what is it? How do we identify it? What exactly is it that he's deviating from? So, for instance, really, when you really just look at him, he's just a guy with tattoos, right? Well, wait a minute. Tattoos in this sense are kind of deviant, right? Don't you think? It's a little bit much. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But what constitutes much? How much tattoos would be too much tattoos? I mean, many of us have tattoos. I have a tattoo. See? Little tattoo. Right? Nobody would consider me to be deviant, right? And there are people with much more elaborate tattoos than I do, than I have, right? So how many tattoos do you need to have before you're considered deviant? Or maybe it's the subject matter of his tattoos, where he's tattooed up as a rotting corpse, right? Maybe if he was tattooed in all flowers and pine trees? No, probably not. We'd probably consider that to be deviant too. One way or the other, for some reason, we've decided that this person doesn't fit into our normal expectations of human behavior, that he is a deviant, right? But when we actually try to locate where this actual deviance comes from, we realize, actually, wait a minute, the rules that define deviance, that define what is normal and what is deviant, aren't are stuff we made up. So, for instance, there are plenty of cultures in Polynesia where it's perfectly normal and acceptable for men to be tattooed pretty much from head to foot, right? So, there's a culturally specific, definitions of deviance, right? So what we're looking at here is what in sociology we refer to as an absolutist model of deviance versus a relativist model of deviance. So if you looked at this guy and you said, what is wrong with this guy? What you're doing is you're making an assumption based on an absolutist model of deviance. In other words, what you're saying is that there's something wrong with the individual, with him as an individual. And you're not taking into consider any external forces. Well, one of the things that we know about sociology is we're all about the external forces, the external things that influence our behavior. We're not worried about the internal drives and all that other kind of stuff. So if we take another look at him and we suggest maybe there isn't something wrong with him, maybe what we need to do is take a look at the rules that we take for granted in our society. And if you do that, if you look at him and go, actually, those are kind of some pretty cool tattoos, and yeah, maybe he has more tattoos than everybody else, but really, he's just a guy with tattoos. Well, now what you're doing is you're looking at this through what we call a relativist model. And the relativist model is the way that sociologists look at deviance. In other words, we look at deviance relative to the society as a whole. And that means that our concepts of deviance may change over time and may change over location and culture. So for instance, if we take, for example, an absolutist model, one of the things that we see happening, for instance, is if we make the assumption that deviance is located in the individual, then that makes life pretty easy. We just kind of deal with those individuals. But there are consequences to that. So, for instance, when you take minority groups in the United States, and when we designate minority groups as minority groups, and then we make assumptions that there's just something different about that particular group, then what we end up doing is we start to look for examples that confirm our biases. So, for instance, in the United States, as you can see from the graph over here, one of the things that we make an assumption of deviance related to blackness. Yes, a lot of our understanding of deviance has a lot to do with race and racial dynamics. So when you actually take a look at the data, for instance, one of the things that we see is that when you take a look at, say, drug use by race, what we actually see is that the drug use among blacks and whites are pretty similar. In fact, the most recent data suggests that there's a little bit less drug use among blacks than there are whites. Yet, what we see is that there's a tremendous amount, over 40% of drug arrests and convictions is of black Americans. Well, they're only 13% of the population. They should only be 13% of the drug use, which, statistically speaking, they are. So how does it work out that they're 40 to 45% of our drug convictions? Well, it's because we're using a racist, absolutist model of deviance. All right. So what we want to do today is we want to kind of question that. So, for instance, take a look at something like heresy, right? Heresy is speaking and acting out in a way that God doesn't like, right? Speaking out against the word of God, or acting in such a way that causes you to question the existence or reality or the rules of God, right? That's heresy. And think about this. Once upon a time, if I committed an act of heresy, wow, I could actually be put to death for that. That was a serious act of deviance, right? But today, we probably commit acts of heresy 4 or 5 times a day, and nobody really pays much attention, right? Well, that means that what constituted deviance once no longer constitutes an act of deviance now, right? Or we could take a look at, say, something more recent, like gay marriage. If you take a look at the graph here, what you're going to see is that sometimes in what looks like about 2011 or so, our attitudes about gay marriage kind of flipped, with more people approving of gay marriage than disapproving of gay marriage. But if you rewind back to just the mid-90s, you see that there's a huge discrepancy. The overwhelming number of people saw gay marriage as being a deviant act. And now, about 60% actually feel that it's really not a big deal, right? And that's just a change that happened over the span of, 25 years? That's really not that big a deal, right? So our concepts of deviance change over time, right? Another one of my favorite is the rule of thumb. We've all probably heard the term the rule of thumb, right? Well, what exactly is the rule of thumb? Well, the rule of thumb is a rule that was a part of English common law, in which it was understood that a husband's legal right to beat his wife was limited to using a stick that was no wider than his thumb. If he used a stick that was wider than his thumb, that was considered to be spousal abuse. Right? But so long as he kept that stick thinner than the width of his thumb, it was totally within his rights to beat his wife up to that point, right? What? Right? By today's standards, we would consider that a person who beats his wife or beats their husband or beats their spouse is deviant, no matter how big their thumbs are, right? That is not a standard. The rules have changed. And therefore, our concepts of what constitutes deviance has changed. And this has a lot to do with how we perceive each other and perceive the other members of our society and what the rules of our society mean, right? So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about some of the major theories with regard to deviance. Now, this is a huge subject. Sociologists have had to deal with deviance a lot, right? There's a lot of different theories. I want to just touch on the basics in this particular lecture, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a link that, or a kind of a worksheet that kind of, I don't want to say worksheet because that insinuates that you have to work. I'll call it a study guide that'll go over some of the other theories, some different theories on deviance that are related to these three major perspectives. Okay, so anyway, let's take a look at the sociology of deviance. All right, so when we take a look at deviance, we take a look at sociology. We're looking at these three major perspectives. I'm not going to review the perspectives. You already have an understanding of what these perspectives are and what they mean, hopefully. And if not, just go back into your notes and review them. All right. So for our purposes, we have a functionalist perspective, a conflict perspective, and an interactionist perspective. We've not talked about. We may have touched on a postmodernist perspective. These are the major perspectives that we've talked about, right? So let's take a look, first of all, at the functionalist perspective. Of course, the functionalist perspective is really going to have to come up with a reason for deviance, right? They're going to have to address deviance because the functionalist perspective makes the assumption that everything contributes to the, long-term phenomena in society are functional, and that they contribute to the overall, stability of society. Well, what about deviants? What about criminals? What about people like that, right? And the functionalist is going to have to deal with these deviants, right? And of course, the very first functionalist that's going to have to deal with this is arguably the first functionalist. Probably close to the second, but either way, it is our buddy Emile Durkheim. He, of course, wants to create sociology as a contiguous science, as a sensible science, and in order to do that, he has to address this problem of deviance, and he's going to do exactly that. He's going to write this big book on deviance, and he's going to explain exactly what is the function of deviance. In other words, how does deviance contribute to overall social stability? And one of the things that Durkheim is going to do is he's going to do kind of like a mental experiment. He's going to ask you to imagine a community of saints, okay, a community of perfect people, right? A community of people who are just universally just and universally wonderful people, right? And now, will deviance exist in such a society, right? And here's the deal. According to Durkheim, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Even a community of saints will have deviance. Now, that community of saints may have deviance based on some really weird rules, but they will still find ways of defining deviance. And why? Why will they have deviance? Well, according to Durkheim, the reason why they're going to have deviance is because deviance serves a function of stability, right? Basically, so what is this function, right? What do you mean, Durkheim, that the functionalists make society more stable? Well, one of the things that he noticed is that, and this is going to be Durkheim, right? So we got Durkheim going on here. And these are the functions of deviance. Functions of deviance. And one of the things that he notices is that it's because of the deviance. It's when people break the rules, right? When people break the rules, we act on that. We punish them. We do something, right? Imagine if the first time somebody spoke out in my class, I absolutely just crushed them and sent them out of the room, right? What would that have told everybody in the class? Ooh, wow, Mr. Andosh is really serious about people raising their hands. So one of the things that deviance does, it's a way of reaffirming and defining the rules, right? We know the society's serious about these particular rules because what ends up happening is the people who violate the rules get dealt with immediately, right? So an example of, there are plenty of examples of this, but a big example of this that comes from the work of a fellow by the name of Kai Erikson, he learned is that back in the 17th century in the Massachusetts Bay colonies, there was a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson, and she was a heretic. She was preaching the Bible. She was teaching things that a larger community didn't like her to teach. They didn't believe that women should be allowed to teach the Bible, right, because they were going to muck it up. So consequently, she was kicked out of the community, and ultimately she was killed by angry Pequots. Well, that meant that in that community, the rule, women don't teach the Bible, was taken so seriously that it was literally a death sentence for the person who violated that rule, right? So we reaffirm the rules, and it clarifies the rules. And you know this because you know that, Mr. I should raise my hand in order to speak in class. So what ends up happening is some of you raise your hands and speak in class. That reaffirms the rules. But some of you raise your hand and speak in class, right? And that leads you to realize, well, maybe I'm not all that concerned about raising that. And then the next person comes along and they put their finger up and then they speak in class, right? And then eventually people start to realize, well, actually, Mr. Andosh is not all that serious about raising your hand in class to speak, and people just start to speak in class, right? Well, that's clarifying the rules. Yeah, there's a rule that you're supposed to raise your hand and speak in class, but really the rule is wait till the other person is done speaking, right? And then what you realize is that if you start to speak when somebody else is speaking, I will say, hold on a minute, and that then clarifies the rule. Oh, okay. It's not about raising my hand. It's about speaking over other people and being courteous. And right. So that clarifies the rules. It's also a way of bringing the community together. Right? So, the people, when you take a deviant, right, and then you completely squash that deviant, when you punish that deviant, you can then turn to the other people in your social group and say, hey, see that guy? He's a deviant. Don't be like him. That person is bad. So the deviants kind of become counter examples. Hey, you don't want to dress like that person because if you dress like that person, everybody's going to think this about you, right? So that person becomes a counterexample, and it is a way of kind of bringing us all together and saying, hey, we're the good people who don't say heretical things, and then there are those heretics over there, and we don't like the heretics over there. It's a way of kind of defining your group boundaries. And then the other thing that's really interesting is that Durkheim says the deviants are the ones who help us create social change. Right? Social change. It's the people who break the rules and force us to confront the rules that that kind of encourages that maybe we should debate changing the rules and making the rules a little bit different, right? So an example of this, there's plenty of examples of this. So for instance, we talked about Anne Hutchinson, the heretic in 17th century Massachusetts Bay Colony. She goes out and she gets killed by Pequots. It wasn't just her. It was she and her 13 children were all executed. So a lot of people in the community are starting to think, well, wait a minute, she did teach the Bible, and actually she kind of had some good points. Was it really worth executing her entire family to enforce and impose this rule. And actually, when you take a look at the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, within a generation, it was actually commonplace for women to teach the Bible. And then, and actually, really, when you think about ground zero of American liberalism, it's pretty much Massachusetts, right? Those things changed. We challenged those rules. But we have more, take, for example, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks broke the law, right? She literally broke the law by refusing to give her seat up on the bus, right? That was a law. That was a rule. She was a deviant. She was actually arrested and processed, and taken in. And that act was that act of deviance brought to the attention of the entire country was like, well, wait a minute. How cool is that? She's just somebody who's sitting on the bus. I sit on the bus all the time. Nobody asked me to change my seat. Maybe this isn't a rule that we want to continue to enforce. And if we break open that crack, breaking open that one crack on that one rule with regard to segregation in the United States, then inspires us to take a look at some of the other rules of segregation in the United States and say, wait a minute, maybe these rules aren't right. Maybe we need to renegotiate these rules and change them. All right, so that's the functionalist perspective, and there are different theories associated with the functionalist perspective. I'm going to include that in the handout. So, for instance, take a special look at strain theory. Strain theory, I think, is a really, really powerful tool to help us understand deviance in society. But I want to move on. I don't want this lecture to be too god-awful long. So I want to move on to the conflict perspective. Now, the conflict perspective, remember, the conflict perspective takes a look at power and class and status and stuff like that. And they notice that, the conflict perspective suggests that structures in society are created by certain groups to serve the interests of those groups. Well, obviously, if those groups are the ones that are deciding what is right and wrong, they're going to decide what constitutes deviance based on the needs of their own particular group, right? So the conflict theorists take a look at how deviance is applied in different ways based on one's power and status in society. So, for instance, we just had a graph that showed that African Americans and white Americans have about the same amount of drug use, right? And yet, the rules of drug use are applied disproportionately to African Americans, right? We had a debate a while back about the use of police violence against suspects. Now, police will use violence against suspects, right? But one of the things that we know from the data is that they disproportionately use violence against people of color, right? Well, that kind of works on this idea of the conflict perspective. The rules are going to be applied differently based on the power of those groups. So, for instance, one of the things that we can look at here is that, like this graph on white-collar crimes, right? So if you take a look, for instance, at the costs of property crimes, of street-level crime, regular crime, right, and white-collar crime, the white-collar crime, it is overwhelmingly more costly to us. The street-level crime barely appears on the graph. Then when you take a look at deaths associated between white-collar crime and regular crime, you see that white-collar crime still way outperforms regular crime, right? Well, then why is it that we put so much effort and so much money and so much actual violence and aggression and coercion into fighting street-level crime and relatively little in white-collar crime? So you take it, for example, our friend here, Donald Blankenship, right? Donald Blankenship, through his inaction and through his willing neglect, was responsible for the deaths of 29 people in one of the mines that he owned. Think about that. If you caused the deaths of 29 people, what would happen to you? You'd be in really, really bad trouble, right? Well, what about Donald Blankenship? Well, Donald Blankenship, he spent about, I think, 18 months. I think he served most of that. 18 months for causing 29 deaths? What about Martha Stewart? Martha Stewart, she famously embezzled like $50,000 through insider trading, right? But what would happen if you stole $50,000? What would happen to you? Would you get 6 months? Probably not, right? And these are the people that got caught, right? These are folks who got caught and got tried and convicted and sent to prison. What about the majority of people who don't get caught? So the idea behind the conflict perspective is that deviance is determined by social power. How much power you have in society determines deviance. So, and especially, for instance, now we can take a look at this from a Marxist perspective. In Marxist perspective, it suggests that, well, yeah, the capitalists, when they do something really bad, like a Donald Blankenship, it's really not that big a deal. But when a street-level criminal violates, say, a property crime, well, that's a crime against capitalism, right? So then that kind of sets the stage for the conflict perspective, right? Also, one of the things that we know that we can kind of use as a subcategory of the conflict perspective is that people with the least power have the least interest in the rules. Right, people with the least power, they're going to have the least interest in the rules. So for instance, if I am poor and I have to survive, and I have to, feed my kids, then, well, yeah, I guess I could go to college and really advance myself, but that's going to take years. What if my kids are like hungry now? Right? Well, I'm probably going to do something that's going to get food in the bellies of my kids, which means if I have to violate the rules by stealing from you, then I might just do that. We can apply this, for instance, to refugees coming into the United States, seeking asylum or trying to find jobs in the United States. You've got a muddy little river there, and somebody said, hey, if you cross that river, you're breaking the law, but all of the economic opportunities are on that side of the river, and my kids are on this side of the river, and we're hungry now. Well, I could. What's the legitimate legal way of doing it? Well, the legitimate legal way of doing it is going to take you about 5 to 10 years to get across that river. I can walk across the river, right? And then in which case I can get access to the things that I need, right? So those who are the least power, the least interest in the rules, right? So that's basically the conflict perspective. Again, I will have a bunch of different theories that kind of talk about the conflict perspective down below. All right, now the final perspective here is the interactionist perspective, right? And this one's a fascinating one. There's a couple of things I want to talk about with the interactionist perspective, and there's a bunch of theories that are associated with the interactionist perspective, and I really like the interactionist theories better than just about any of them. But the interactionist theories are really kind of interesting because the interactionists, just remember, the functionalists and the conflict theories, they are structuralist theories, right? They want to look at the big picture elements of society and how do those big picture elements of society influence behavior, right? But the interactionist is a little bit different. The interactionist is interested in interactions. They're looking at the society from the bottom up, right? How does interaction influence deviant and normative behavior, right? And that's really interesting stuff. So for the interactionist is interested in, maybe deviance is learned, right? Maybe deviance is a learned behavior. So they have an idea that we can call social learning theory. Social learning. Okay? In other words, we learn deviant behaviors pretty much exactly the same way that we learn normal behaviors, right? We learn those behaviors from our significant others. If we are associating with significant others, then one of the things that we'll understand is if the significant others that we're interacting with are deviant, chances are pretty good we're probably going to be deviant as well, or at least willing to accept that deviance, right? So this is the idea of social learning theory, right? Another element of the interactionists is they say, well, wait a minute, maybe the social learning also has to do with opportunity, right? So we have what's called opportunity theory. I'll get into that a little bit later on, right? Because it's not just a matter of maybe I'll steal because I have an opportunity to steal. We're talking about significant deviant behavior, right? But now think about this. Another element of the interactionist perspective is when you really stop and think about it, how many of us have ever committed a deviant act? How many of us have ever stolen something? How many of us have committed petty crimes, vandalism, skipped class, whatever? Pretty much, if you really break it down, if you really think about it, I think just about all of us have committed some kind of act of deviance in our lifetime, right? Maybe we've even committed serious acts of deviance, right? Yet, not all of us are defined as being deviant, right? Well, why is that? Well, the interactionists have a theory for you, and it's one of my favorite theories. And that theory is called labeling theory. Oh man, I don't like that. I'll use this one. We'll call it labeling theory. That's much better. Labeling theory? Is that spelled correctly? Yeah. Okay. So labeling theory. And basically what this means is that what makes a person a deviant is because a label of deviance has been applied to that person and that label has been accepted. And it becomes especially true when that label is accepted by the individual who received the label, right? And one of the things that we know, if you get into teaching, one of the things that you learn is that students will accept the labels, oftentimes live down to your expectations, right? If they've got somebody like a teacher telling them that they're no good or that they're stupid or that they can't learn or whatever, the chances are pretty good that student will accept that as a valid fact and will incorporate that into their identity. In other words, they will accept that label as being right and valid. So this is the labeling theory. So what basically happens is, how somebody becomes a label, let's try that again. How somebody becomes deviant is the label deviant has been applied to them through some kind of a social process. Maybe it's getting suspended at school, right? Oh, that kid gets suspended. Oh, you have Jimmy in class. Oh, you're going to have a hard time. Yeah. All right, so what that means is that a label now. Jimmy, as soon as Jimmy comes into class, all of my other teacher friends have told me about Jimmy, right? That's a process by which a label has been applied to Jimmy. And now, I'm going to keep my eye on Jimmy. Now, maybe Bobby is doing the same things that Jimmy's doing, but I got my eye on Jimmy, not Bobby, right? In fact, Bobby may be even instigating Jimmy. And what's going to happen? Bobby's been screwing around for, months now, but the minute Jimmy's I'm going to nail him, right? Oh, he's going to ISS. Right, that label is being applied. I identified Jimmy as a deviant, not Bobby, because that label has been applied to Jimmy. And since Jimmy keeps getting caught and Jimmy keeps getting sent to ISS, he eventually gets the realization that, you know what, I'm probably just no good. And that's just the way I am. I'm just an awful person. Right? He accepts the label. That label becomes, And then what will end up happening is something that we call tertiary deviance, which I'll get into in the little study guide. Tertiary deviance is where Jimmy says, you know what, the heck with this. School sucks. It's stupid. I'm perfectly normal. It's the school that sucks, and I'm not going to participate. That's tertiary deviance. So what he's doing is he's saying, hey, I'm actually the normal one. All of you are idiots in this school, and I'm not going to participate, and he's going to drop out. All right? So those are the consequences of labeling theory, right? I think labeling theory is probably one of the most powerful theories for understanding deviance that we have. It's one of my favorites, and it's especially important for those of us who go into teaching, if you go into psychology or counseling, social work, anything where you are part of that process by which a label is applied to somebody. When you go into law enforcement, when you process that person by taking their finger, filling out that report, taking their fingerprint, and giving them that file, giving them that record, you've applied a label, and that label is going to stick with them, right? These are things that we need to keep in mind as professionals, I think. So anyway, all right, that's the video that I have for you. Again, I'm going to have a lot more detailed stuff in the study guide, but I did want to go over some of the basics here with you, and hopefully this didn't turn out to be too long. I think I'm okay here. Anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Send me a question or a comment through Classroom. You can Zoom me. My sociology Zoom time is going to be 10 to 11. Um, so you can always just Zoom me, but quite frankly, probably the best way is to go through the email, and I will respond to emails pretty quickly. All right. So hopefully, if you have any questions, let me know, and otherwise, welcome to COVID University.